So, in 15 minutes or less, I'm going to just kind of give you an introduction about the challenges the U.S. to the U.S. of the global, U.S. and global food system, or in other words, let's figure out how we're going to feed the world without eating the world. Or we can maybe title this, How Green Was My Revolution? Or possibly, keep it simple, stupid. There's a number of ways of thinking about agriculture and global food system, but I'm going to say this, that if we can get our hand on this and figure this out, every other problem that we're dealing with that we've been identifying is going to get taken care of, right? So we hear all the time, we're going to be 9.2 billion people in 2050, and we have to increase our food production by 70%. And that number comes from FAO and UN, and it's kind of the number that we throw around. Those of us in the College of Agriculture, it's like the first thing we say whenever we give our talks. But I'm just going to say that maybe if we kind of start rethinking and twisting around our food system, that maybe this idea of having to actually increase production by 70% isn't exactly what we have to be doing. But in order to understand what we're talking about, let's talk about the food system. So really what I'd like to do for the next few minutes is really focus on what exactly we talk about. This is not a local food talk. This is really looking at the food system as a whole. So how many of you subscribe to successful farming? How many people are in the College of Agriculture in this room? This is kind of the industry, this is our industry rag. How many of you subscribe to organic farming? How many subscribe to Modern Farmer? Those are not our industry. So the people that read this are going to be the guys that drive the big tractors, right? And this was October of this year. This was the cover of Successful Farming. And it's really, I think, fascinating because it tells a lot of different stories. Meet your new boss. So in farming, it's kind of interesting to think, have we been actually not talking to these people or feeding these people? So this idea and disconnect that we have with many of the agricultural production, in our agricultural production system, is quite different from what our producers are thinking if all of a sudden urban consumers are our new boss. And so I think I want to pose this to you all and think about this, is how information flows and network flows work is going to be critical in how we're going to be able to deal with issues, especially within the sustainable foods, in creating a more sustainable food system. This is what we're talking about with what we mean by a food system. So a food system is everything from the production to the consumer and all in between. How do we get food from farm to table? And it looks very linear, right? Let's see, is this the... It looks very linear. You know, we have a producer and we have consumer, and there's some farm inputs, and there's different manufacturing handling, and there's different ways, and somebody's going to, and how those arrows work, it's kind of real to connect things. So blue represents essentially product that moves through that system, and red is most typically thought of as money that flows backwards as a way of communicating. Right? And there's a signal from the consumer to the producer. And you can see, even in a traditional system, that signal back and forth has a lot of noise in it. And that's really important to begin to understand. And we can break that down in those categories, and we can see the complexity of the system and how we're getting from producer to consumer. There's processing, marketing, and all these things. And all of those little boxes just shows the complexity within each of that systems. So this becomes a very, very noisy system in trying to communicate between those producers and our consumers. But this is the way we typically think about how we're communicating to producers. And this is really important because this is how much goes to the farmer for every dollar you spend on food, 10 cents. So you can imagine if every dollar you spend, only 10 cents goes back to the farmer, there isn't a very strong information signal that goes between what you're consuming, what you want to consume, and what you want to produce. And then all of this is in between. What's really fascinating here to keep in mind is this is the food service industry. So when we talk about the food system, and we talk about the food system in Georgia, and we say 1 out of every 6 people in the state of Georgia is employed in the food system, we're talking about 45,000 farmers. So those millions of other people are in other parts of the food system. The majority are the guys that are flipping your burgers at McDonald's. And so that's really important to understand if you want to look at how we're going to manage that food system, is who are we really talking to and who we need to be thinking about in dealing with the food system. And this is just looking at this, and it's a little bit misleading because it actually shows full and part-time jobs. But there aren't too many farmers that actually make their living as full-time farmers. But you can see that we're really overwhelmed by the food service industry. And that's something to know, that we spend over half of our dollars on buying food when eating out. We are not buying food that we are going to be cooking and producing for ourselves, we as a whole. So, most of the folks that are in the industry are the ones that are actually cooking your food. And then the other thing in looking at solutions is really thinking about how our income is spent. And I think that this is a really key point here. We spend, here we are, 12% on food. It's actually closer to 10. That's really dependent upon who you are and what your income level is. Obviously, lower your income, the higher percent you pay on food. But if we want to talk about ways of dealing with food and food systems, if you're paying over a third of your income on household and rent, sometimes we need to be thinking about some of these great ideas about urban agriculture and local foods. If you're going to take that land, that's urban land, and put it and say, I'm going to take that parcel and make a garden out of it or community food, all of a sudden you're taking away the ability of putting a house somewhere. So we need to be thinking about our solutions relative to the rest of the food system and how we're going to produce. Now, urban agriculture is important. It helps us with diversifying, but we need to be thinking about where our actual solutions are going to lie in dealing with the food system as a whole. So things like working on reducing transportation costs and housing costs become critical. The other thing we have to recognize, oh yes, my other title, death by salad. 50% of the fruits and vegetables that we consume in the US are imported. Now, we know that global trade is important, especially with foods. We wouldn't have coffee, we wouldn't have tea, we wouldn't have bananas if we didn't import our foods and fruits and vegetables. So I'm not here to say that we should be growing everything locally. There's risk to both being global and there's risk for being local, and we need to take into consideration. But the fact of the matter is that if you're going to go out to a restaurant and get a cheeseburger, you're probably consuming food from about 200,000 different producers in that one burger. And that's all the things that go into the bun, and all the things that go into the sauce, and all the things that go into the ketchup, and all the things that go into various things. There's a huge number of producers that help to produce all of these things. But what we have to recognize is the concern about food safety. and the challenges that we have. And these are the challenges that we have at all levels of that food system in making sure that that food, the thing about food is it can kill you quickly or very slow. Oh, we're not there yet. I thought, wrong slide. All right, but this is talking about that risk. So this is, of the 50% of the fruits and vegetables that we import, 50% of that comes from California. So water becomes a really critical issue with understanding our food system. This keeps me up at night. This literally keeps me up at night. Over 50% of the world's population is found there. If we're growing the population in 2050 by another 2 billion people, they ain't coming here. They're coming here and here. Next slide. This is put it together that really scares me. This is global water insecurity. This is places that are at risk to not having water available to provide the needs of their people. So remember where we saw where all those people live? That's where all those people live. So if we really want to think about the food system, local is important and diversifying our local, but the fact of the matter is we have water and we have technology to better use water here. And so there's this real need to think about these. This is right now 2.5 billion people. And most of that water that we're talking about is coming from glaciers from the Himalayan plateau. That's what's feeding the surface water of China, India, and the entire Mekong Delta or Southeast Asia. Diets and diet diversity is really important. And I wanted to call this one, Let's All Eat Our Wheaties. But thinking about what we eat in our diet and our choices in looking at food production, we're reliant globally on 14 bird and mammal species that make up 90% of what we eat. For fisheries, we're basically relying on 10% of the species. And for some reason in the US, we think that wild caught is better than farming fish. We do not wild catch any other protein. So let's think about this. Can we do better at how we're going to farm our fish? But this is really scary. 60% of all our energy in food comes from 5 different cereal crops. Most of the production is in rice, wheat, maize, millet, and sorghum. Maize is corn. I actually had to learn that, right? So we've got to be thinking about what's really the diversity of the food system we eat. And in fact, I would say that the larger the diversity of our diet, the more research is going to go into different animals and plants. So maybe we should just go around and eat everything. Okay, this is death. This is the slow death. So nutrition is really it's a syndrome, right? We have as many people on this planet now that are extremely malnourished as we do that we have obese. So our diet we need to be thinking about, and I'll say that we've got more emphasis coming in sustainable food systems, and interest coming at this is our public health emergency. I know a lot of folks are really interested in infectious diseases, but the fact of the matter, the leading cause of death aren't infectious diseases. They're heart disease, diabetes, all of these things are what we call diet and lifestyle diseases. But as we think about building that food pyramid, we have to recognize that there's environmental impacts and understanding the environmental impacts versus changing those environmental impacts versus what we're telling people to eat. Last thing, food waste. 40, 50, 60% of what we are producing now goes to waste. It's different in developed worlds and developing world. Ours is post-consumers. We all have the self-composting refrigerator at home. It's much different as you move into the developing world where it's actually post-production, processing, things like that, and storage. So where do we go? One is we have to recognize that how we feed people and what we feed people is really important. That we need to make sure we're looking at improving the way we use our natural resources. And finally, we need to bring back and talk the rural and urban interface. It needs to come back, and we need to be communicating between these folks. And that's it.
Nice job.